Diane Foster tore a $5 million check in half in front of an 8-year-old girl, dropped the pieces at her father's feet, and then picked up the phone to report him for fraud. 11 minutes later, her own boss pushed through the door, looked at the papers scattered across the tile, and said 2 words that drained every drop of color out of her face. If stories like this one stay with you, take a second and subscribe before we go any further, because the ending is not the one you are expecting. The check was real. That is the part people get wrong when they hear this story secondhand. It had cleared at 9 that morning. The confirmation was already sitting in the bank's own system, 3 clicks from the desk where Diane was standing. Ethan Walker was 42 years old and had learned a long time ago that the world made up its mind about a man before he ever opened his mouth. For 6 years he had raised his daughter alone in a narrow house at the edge of Maple Hollow, a town where nobody looked twice at a 15-year-old sedan or a canvas jacket with the cuffs gone soft. Grace's mother had left when Grace was 2, chasing a different life in a different city, and Ethan had kept going because no other option had ever presented itself as reasonable. He drove Grace to school every morning. He cooked dinner every night. He had never missed a recital, a parent meeting, or a Saturday soccer game, not even the season he was closing deals until 2 in the morning. Nobody at Grace's school knew that the man in the faded jacket had built Walker Capital Group out of a rented office and a second-hand desk into a firm that managed billions. Ethan liked it that way. He did not want a daughter who believed money made a person important or who learned to read a man's worth off the label sewn into his coat. So he wore the same watch he had worn for a decade, drove the same car he had bought used, and folded his success quietly into the background of an ordinary life, visible only to the handful of people who needed to know it existed. That morning, the money from an early stake he had sold in a technology company had landed, and he had already decided where it was going. Half into a fund for Grace locked until she was old enough to understand what it meant. The other half to seed a scholarship for kids being raised by one parent instead of 2, the kind of household he understood in his bones, down to the specific exhaustion of folding laundry at midnight. He brought Grace along because they had a plan for the rest of the afternoon, and she had been narrating it since breakfast. Bank first, then the bookstore where he had promised her 3 books instead of the usual one, then dinner at the diner on 5th Street where the waitress always brought her extra pickles without being asked. 10 minutes, he told her, in the parking lot, 15 if the line is bad. There was one other thing on the schedule that Grace did not know about because it was boring and involved men in suits. At 5:15, after the branch closed to the public, Ethan was supposed to sit down in the back office of that same building with the regional president of Holstead National to walk through the last page of an agreement between the bank and Walker Capital. It was a deal worth $750 million and 11 months of work. Ethan had suggested meeting at the branch precisely because it was small, quiet, and nobody there would make a fuss. They walked into the Ellsworth branch of Holstead National at 4:50. Ethan had banked at that building for 15 years, since before Grace was born, since before Walker. Capital had a name anyone outside a small circle of investors would have recognized. The woman behind the manager's desk had been there 5 weeks. Diane Foster's eyes moved over Ethan the moment the door swung shut behind him. Down to Grace, out through the glass to the sedan at the curb with the small dent in the rear quarter panel. Then back again, and something in her face settled into a decision. A man in a pressed suit came in after them and was greeted before he reached the counter. Ethan and Grace stood at the rope while 3 tellers found things to do with their hands. Grace tugged his sleeve. "Why is nobody helping us?" "Because we haven't waited long enough to be sure of anything yet," Ethan said. "Give people a chance to surprise you." She frowned at that. She was 8. She'd already noticed that the man in the suit had not waited at all. When they finally reached the window, Ethan laid the check face up on the counter and asked for it to be deposited into the account he had held there for 15 years. The teller's eyes caught on the number and went wide, and then without a word she stepped back from her own drawer. Diane was behind the counter in 4 seconds. She did not pull up his account. She did not touch the keyboard. What she did was ask him in a voice pitched to reach the far wall of the lobby where exactly a man like him had come by a check like this. Ethan answered every question. He put his driver's license on the counter, his bank card, his account number written out in his own handwriting because she had not looked at the card. The signed paperwork from the share sale, 4 pages of it, with the issuing bank's letterhead across the top. "You can call them," he said, The number's printed right there. It takes 2 minutes and it settles this. Diane looked at the documents the way people look at a menu they have already decided against. A man carrying $5 million, she said, does not drive that car, and he does not wear that coat. I'll dial it myself, Ethan said, and he took out his phone. That was the moment it turned. He had the number half entered when Diane reached across the counter and put her hand flat over the screen. You do not make calls at my counter. A young teller named Rachel Simmons stepped forward with the branch phone already in her hand. Diane, I can verify it in 1 minute. I've got the line right here. Back to your station. Diane did not look at her. Now. Rachel stood there a beat longer than she should have, then went. By then, half the lobby had turned to watch and 4 phones had come up. A man near the deposit slip said loudly enough to carry that bringing a kid along was a smart touch, that it made a scam look like a family errand. Nobody told him to be quiet. The phone stayed up. Grace's hand found her father's and closed hard around 2 of his fingers. Ethan felt the change in her grip and understood that whatever else happened in this building, his daughter was going to remember it. He kept his voice level. There is one more thing you should know before you go any further. At 5:15 this afternoon, I have a meeting in the back office of this branch with Gerald Whitman, your regional president. It's on the branch calendar. You can check it from where you're standing. Diane laughed. It was a short, ugly sound, and it made 2 people in the lobby wince. Of course you do. Check it. I don't need to check anything. She picked the check up off the counter, held it at eye level between 2 fingers, and turned so the lobby could see her do it. People like you do not walk in here with $5 million. Then she tore it in half, and then again into quarters, and she opened her hand and let the pieces drift down onto the tile between Ethan's shoes. The lobby went completely silent. Somebody's phone kept recording. Grace crouched to gather the pieces. Ethan caught her under the arm before her knees touched the floor and drew her back up against him because he was not going to let his daughter kneel on a bank floor to pick up something a stranger had just used to humiliate her father. 1/4 of the check had landed apart from the rest near the leg of a counter stool. Grace got that one before he could stop her, and she closed her fist around it, and she did not let go of it for the next 4 hours. Ethan looked at Diane. He did not raise his voice at all, which somehow made it worse. You just tore up a scholarship fund, he said, and you did it in front of my kid. Diane heard that as a threat. She stepped back to her desk, picked up the phone, and told the dispatcher there was a black male in the lobby using fraudulent documents, threatening her staff and refusing to leave. Then she pointed at the door and told Dean Coleman to escort him out. Dean had worked that branch for 9 years. He was 51, built like a man who had been bigger once, and he looked at the torn paper on the floor and then at the little girl attached to the man he had just been ordered to remove, and he did not move for a full 3 seconds. Sir, he said finally, I'm going to need you to come with me. His hand settled on Ethan's upper arm, and Ethan noticed that it settled rather than gripped. That distinction would matter later, though neither of them knew it yet. Ethan understood exactly where he was standing. He could refuse and turn a bad afternoon into something with sirens in it, with Grace 6 inches away. Or he could walk and let the truth catch up on its own schedule. He had spent 6 years teaching his daughter that a man is what he does when he is provoked, and there was no version of this where he unlearned that lesson in front of her. He walked, slowly, but he did not walk out. I'll go as far as the door, he told Dean. Not through it, not until somebody in this building makes 1 phone call. They had covered maybe 12 feet when Grace stopped, turned around, and looked back at the pieces on the floor. Those were ours, she said. Then she wrapped both arms around her father's waist and pressed her face into his side and asked Dean in a voice too small for the room, please not to take her dad away. Dean's jaw worked. He kept walking, but his hand came off Ethan's arm and stayed at his side after that. From behind the counter, Diane told the nearest teller to keep the child back so she could not be used to obstruct branch security. That was the only moment Ethan's calm cracked. He had taken the accusation. He had taken the comments about the coat in the car. He had watched $5 million come apart in a stranger's hands, and had kept his voice flat through all of it. But he turned toward that teller with something entirely new in his face and said quietly, Nobody puts a hand on my daughter. The teller did not move. She looked, if anything, relieved not to have to. Diane spread her arms toward the lobby as if she had just proved a point. You see it, she said. That's what I've been telling you since he walked in. And Ethan, standing there with his hands deliberately open at his sides, understood that in this particular room, every word out of his mouth and every motion of his body was being read through a lens that had finished its work before he had said hello. He lowered his voice. He kept his palms visible. He drew Grace in against his hip, away from everyone, and he thought about how strange it was that a father's instinct to stand between his child and a stranger could be entered into evidence against him inside of a minute. Rachel came out from behind her station a second time. "She's 8 years old," Rachel said to the room, more than to Diane, "and he has offered 3 times to let us verify the check. 3 times. It is 1 phone call." "Say 1 more word," Diane told her, "and you will not have a job at close of business." Rachel stopped. She was 24 and she had rent, and she had watched Diane run people out of that lobby twice already in 5 weeks, and had told herself both times that it was not her place. She looked over at Grace's face, at the way the girl's chin had started to go, and she understood that whatever she had told herself before was not going to hold up anymore. She didn't say another word, but she moved sideways quietly until she was standing where she could see Diane's terminal screen. Around them, the phones kept recording. 11 people in that lobby, and not one of them lowered a phone to speak. They wanted the footage. None of them wanted to be the first person to spend anything on a stranger. Grace looked around at all of it, at the raised phones and the lowered eyes, and she asked her father a question loud enough to reach the walls. "Why isn't anybody saying you didn't do anything?" 3 people looked at the ceiling. 1 woman looked at the floor. Nobody answered her and nobody moved. That silence went into Ethan harder than anything Diane had said, because he could see on his daughter's face the exact moment she filed it away. She was learning something about how the world distributes courage, and she was learning it on a Tuesday afternoon at 4:58 between a rope stanchion and a rack of mortgage brochures. Dean guided them the last few steps toward the glass. Ethan counted them the way he counted his breaths during a bad negotiation, a habit that kept his mind from running ahead of him. Grace's hand stayed locked around his fingers. Her other fist was still closed around that torn quarter of the check. Diane stood behind the counter with her arms folded, satisfied, entirely unaware that the man walking toward her exit could dissolve her branch by close of business. At 2 minutes past 5, the door swung inward, and Gerald Whitman walked in early for his meeting briefcase in hand coat over his arm, expecting a quiet back office and a signature page. He got 4 steps into the lobby before he stopped. He saw a security guard walking Ethan Walker toward the door. He saw a child crying into the man's coat. He saw a scatter of torn paper across the tile near the counter, and he didn't need anyone to explain to him what it had been, because he had personally signed off on the wire that funded it. His briefcase hit the floor. "Mr. Walker?" 2 words pitched to carry, and every head in the lobby turned. Dean's hand came off Ethan entirely, and he stepped back like a man who had just discovered what he was holding. Diane crossed the floor fast, already talking, explaining that she had just stopped a $5 million fraud attempt in progress. Gerald let her finish. Then he said, "Do you have the first idea who this man is?" Diane opened her mouth, closed it. She looked at Ethan, then at Grace, then back at Gerald, searching for a version of the last 11 minutes that would still work in the light that had just come into the room. "He's the founder of Walker Capital Group," Gerald said, and he said it to the whole lobby, not to her. "He is one of the largest clients this institution has. He has banked at this branch for 15 years, which is 9 years longer than you have worked for this company. I'm standing here because I have a 5:15 with him in that office, which is on your calendar, which you evidently did not open." He looked down at the floor. "And that check cleared at 9:06 this morning. The confirmation is in our system. It has been all day." He crouched down then so that he was at Grace's eye level, and he told her he was sorry. Not sorry it happened, sorry to her by name for what she had watched inside a building with his signature on the letterhead. It was the first time since they had walked through the doors that anyone in that lobby had spoken to Grace as though her fear counted for something. She looked up at her father to check whether it was safe to believe him. Around the room, phones came down. Nobody deleted anything. The man who had suggested Grace was a prop moved toward the exit and became very interested in his own shoes. Grace's grip tightened on her father's hand as he passed. She had recognized the voice without needing to see the face. Diane straightened her blazer and cleared her throat as though composure were a thing you could reapply. "With respect," she said, If a man is going to carry that kind of money, he might dress the part or identify himself at the door. This could have been avoided. Ethan spoke for the first time since Gerald had come in. "Say that again," he said, slowly, "so the cameras get it." Diane did not say it again. "I want to make sure I have it right," Ethan went on. "Your position is that I owed you proof I was worth serving, and that failing to provide it up front, I earned this. So tell me, how much money does a man need before your branch treats him like a person? Give me the number. I'll tell my scholarship kids to hit it before they come in." "I followed procedure," Diane said. "I followed procedure." Gerald pointed at the floor without looking at it. "Name it. Name the procedure that authorizes a branch manager to destroy a customer's legal property in front of his child. Page and section." She could not because it does not exist, and everyone standing in that lobby now understood that it did not exist. So she pivoted one more time and said that frankly bringing a child into a bank had made the whole thing more emotional than it needed to be. Something went out of Ethan's face at that, not anger, something colder and more decided. Gerald actually took half a step back. "Badge," Gerald said. "Keys, now. Do not touch your terminal, do not touch your phone. Everything at that station is preserved as of this minute." She surrendered the badge. Then, while the lobby's attention was on Gerald, she drifted back behind her desk and her hands went to the keyboard. Rachel got there first. She put her palm flat over the keys and held it there. On the screen was an internal note added to Ethan's account at 4:57 that afternoon. 4 words of it visible above Rachel's hand, threatening customer high fraud risk. "That stays," Rachel said. Then she turned to Gerald and told him evenly that there were 4 cameras covering the teller line that the branch retained 90 days, and that every second of the past 12 minutes existed from at least 3 angles, including the one directly above the counter. Diane's face lost the rest of its color. She had genuinely forgotten the cameras. People who are certain they are in the right usually do. Gerald terminated her on the floor of the lobby in front of the same customers who had watched her tear the check apart. She asked to continue the conversation in an office. "No," he said. "You did it out here. You will answer for it out here, not behind a door where it can quietly become nothing." With Dean, he was slower. He said the footage would show what it showed, that Dean had never applied force and had released Ethan the instant a senior voice entered the room, and that he was suspended pending review rather than terminated. Dean nodded. His shoulders came down about an inch. "I knew it was wrong when she said it," he told nobody in particular. "I just didn't trust myself enough to say so out loud." Ethan, still holding Grace against his side, found he had nothing left in him for the guard. He had felt that hand settle instead of grip. It was a small thing. It was not nothing. The police arrived at 5:19, responding to a call describing a black male committing fraud and threatening staff. 2 officers came through the door, scanning the lobby, and Ethan felt his chest tighten in exactly the same place it had tightened when Dean's hand first landed, a reflex he had not chosen and could not talk himself out of. Gerald met them halfway and told them the report had been false. It did not end there because the call had already been logged, and a logged call generates a report. So Ethan stood in the middle of the lobby with his daughter pressed against him and gave a statement about why he had come to deposit his own money into his own account, keeping his answers short and factual, refusing to let a single note of frustration into his voice in case somebody heard it as agitation. The older of the 2 officers apologized while he wrote and said under his breath that dispatch had made this sound like something else entirely. Rachel gave her statement without softening a word of it, including the part where she had been threatened with her job for offering to dial a phone number. 4 customers handed over video. 2 of them apologized to Ethan while they waited, and 1 woman admitted she had started recording 40 seconds before it occurred to her to say anything, and that she had never gotten around to the second part. A 10-second clip was online before the officers finished writing. It showed Diane holding the check up at eye level, turning so the room could see, tearing it and letting the pieces fall. In the bottom left of the frame, out of focus, an 8-year-old girl reaches for them. By the time Ethan and Grace walked out of that building, it had a few thousand views. By midnight, it had 2 million. News vans were parked outside the Ellsworth branch before noon the next day. Reporters worked out within hours that Ethan was a single father of 6 years standing, and that the money Diane had put on the floor had been earmarked to launch a scholarship for children raised by one parent. That detail did more damage to the bank than the video had. People can argue about a torn check. Nobody wants to be caught on the wrong side of a torn scholarship. The sentence Diane had said at the counter got repeated on every outlet in the country until you could not turn on a television without hearing it in her voice. Reporters also went looking into her employment history, and what they found was not a bad afternoon. It was a pattern. 2 branches back complaints, accounts frozen without explanation, deposits held for review that had no business being held. All of it filed closed within a week and buried. The internal investigation Gerald ordered found at least a dozen prior complaints sitting in old files, every one of them closed without any real review. A teller who had quit the branch 2 years earlier told investigators she had reported something nearly identical involving a 79-year-old man whose account Diane froze for 11 days over a deposited insurance settlement. That complaint had been closed in 6 days with no action taken and had sat undisturbed until $5 million ended up in pieces on the same floor. Employees who had watched it happen for years were suddenly being asked why nobody had done anything. Some said they had assumed it was being handled above their level. Most said they had been afraid of their own jobs, which was the honest answer, and which was also the whole problem. Holstead National's stock slid 9% in 2 days. The board convened an emergency session and began calling Gerald hourly men who had never in their careers asked about a branch manager, all of them suddenly desperate to know how fast this could be contained. More than one suggested settling privately with Ethan before the story grew any further. "He is not a man you can buy quiet," Gerald told them over and over, "and trying will end up on television too." Within 48 hours, the police closed the case, confirming no fraud and no threat of any kind, and noting for the record that the original report had been false when it was made. Diane lost her job, then her license, and picked up a civil rights suit and a charge for filing a false police report. Lawyers began contacting her former customers. None of that was the part that stayed with Ethan. There was one more thing smaller than any of it that Ethan did not tell anyone about for a long time. That Wednesday afternoon, he went to pick Grace up from school and found her sitting alone on the low wall by the flagpole instead of waiting under the awning with the other kids. 2 boys in her class had watched the video at home with their parents. One of them had asked her at lunch whether her dad was the guy who got arrested at the bank. He had not been arrested. He had not been charged with anything. He had never been closer to a set of handcuffs than the width of that lobby. And it had still turned into the first sentence of his daughter's life at that school, inside of a day and a half, and there was no press release in the world that was going to reach a cafeteria table. Ethan sat down on the wall next to her and did not say anything for a while. "I told him you didn't," Grace said, eventually. "I told him a man came in and said your name and everybody stopped. That's what happened. But then Ava said that only worked because you're rich." She scuffed her shoe against the brick. And I didn't know what to say to that, because it's true. 8 years old, and she had already found the load-bearing wall of the whole thing and put her hand flat against it. That was 4 hours before the question at the kitchen table. He had been carrying it around ever since, and by the time the lawyers arrived on his porch with their number and their claws, it had stopped being a feeling and had turned into something closer to a set of instructions. The part that stayed with him happened on the second night at the kitchen table, over a dinner neither of them was eating. Grace had the torn quarter of the check flattened out beside her plate. She had been carrying it around since the moment it hit the floor. She looked up and said, "Dad, if you weren't rich, would anybody have said sorry?" Ethan set down his fork. He sat there for a long moment looking for an answer that would not be a lie, and he could not find one because he knew exactly what would have happened. He had been cleared because a man with a title had walked through a door at 2 minutes past 5. That was the entire mechanism. He had spent his adult life building something precisely so that he would never be at the mercy of a room's assumptions, and the lesson of the last 2 days was that he had succeeded and that the success was worth nothing to anybody but him. Thousands of people walked into branches like that one every day. None of them had a regional president on the calendar. "No," he said finally. "Probably not." Grace thought about it. "That's not fair." "No." Outside, a car slowed near the house, the 4th one that evening, somebody craning to see the place where the man from the video lived. Ethan got up and pulled the curtain closed and sat back down across from his daughter, who was the only audience he had ever actually cared about. Everyone online wanted to argue about the check. Almost nobody was asking the question his 8-year-old had just asked at her own kitchen table. The lawyers came on the third day. 3 of them in suits that looked expensive and out of place against a porch with a warped board in it and a 15-year-old sedan in the drive. They had the offer prepared before they arrived, a personal settlement with a number on it large enough that one of them said it twice, a public apology from the bank. The termination of several employees already underway, all of it contingent on 2 things: that Ethan sign the $750 million agreement on the original schedule and that he say nothing further publicly about what had happened inside the Ellsworth branch. They laid the paperwork across his kitchen table, the same table where Grace had asked her question 2 nights before. In the next room, she was doing long division while grown men in good suits discussed the price of making a public humiliation disappear. Ethan let them get all the way to the end without interrupting. Then he said, "No." The lead attorney started to say something about flexibility on the number. "Not the number," Ethan said. "The clause. I'm not being paid to be quiet. Take the personal settlement off the table entirely. I don't want $1 of it." They did not know what to do with that. In their experience, everyone wanted the dollar. "The deal stays on the table," Ethan went on. "The $750 million. I'll sign it, but I have terms and none of them are about my bank account." Part of him had wanted to walk. He could have killed that agreement with 1 sentence, cost the bank its largest deal in a decade, ended 3 or 4 careers at the top of the building, taken Grace somewhere with no cameras and never set foot in a Holstead branch again. It would have felt tremendous for about a week. But he kept coming back to what he had watched in that lobby. Not Diane. Diane was a single person, and a single person can be removed in 11 minutes, which is exactly how long it had taken. What he could not stop thinking about was the 11 other people who had stood there with their phones up, and Rachel, who had been right, and who had been threatened with her livelihood for being right, and who had needed to weigh her rent against a stranger's dignity in real time. And Dean, who had known and had not trusted himself enough to say so out loud, and who was almost certainly not the only person in that company carrying that particular silence around. Firing 1 manager fixed 1 manager. It did nothing at all for the next person who walked through those doors with the wrong coat on and no meeting on the calendar. So he told the lawyers to write. Every branch in the region would be audited for discriminatory conduct by outside investigators, not by the bank's own compliance office, with the findings published rather than filed. No single employee could freeze or deny a customer's account alone. 2 managers or it does not happen. Any customer in a dispute would have the right to demand independent verification and to have it performed while they stood there, rather than being left to the judgment of whoever happened to be behind the counter that day. Any employee who reported wrongdoing would be protected from retaliation in writing with a reporting line that did not run through their own branch manager. Ethan named that one personally. He had watched a 24-year-old teller do the math on her own rent in the middle of that lobby, and he didn't want anyone else doing it. Frontline staff, security included, would be trained on how to question an order that was clearly wrong and on the fact that they were permitted to. Security footage and transaction records could not be deleted or overwritten once a complaint had been filed against an employee. Customer rights would be posted in plain language inside every branch at the height of a person standing in line, not folded into a pamphlet nobody has ever picked up. And the bank would publish how it had handled every complaint it had previously buried, including the ones sitting in files before anyone had ever heard of the Ellsworth branch. The last term he wrote himself. Holstead National would fund a permanent assistance program for single-parent families, seeded with the same money that had ended up on that lobby floor. The board fought it for 6 days. 2 of the terms in particular they called excessive, then unprecedented, then in one memorable email that later surfaced in discovery, an admission of liability with a marketing budget attached to it. Gerald sat through all of it. He reminded them more than once that they were weighing the cost of accepting these terms against the cost of explaining on the evening news why they had refused them. Every condition was accepted and written into the final agreement with a published timeline for when each one took effect. Diane's license was permanently revoked 11 weeks later. She fought the civil rights suit for a while and then stopped fighting it. The false report charge went through the county court in under an hour on a Thursday morning that nobody televised. 4 employees who had helped close previous complaints against her without review were placed under formal investigation, and 2 of them resigned before it concluded, which told everybody most of what they needed to know about the years before Ethan ever walked through that door. Dean was reinstated once the review confirmed what the footage had already shown. He was also placed into the training program Ethan had insisted on in the first cohort, learning alongside 40 other people how to recognize an instruction that had crossed a line and how to say so before it was too late to matter. He came over to Ethan in the parking lot on his second week back and stood there a moment before he got the words out. "I should have said something," he said. The second she said it. "I had 9 years there and she had 5 weeks and I still didn't open my mouth." "You didn't grab me," Ethan said. "You put your hand on my arm and you let go the second somebody gave you a reason to. I noticed. My daughter noticed." "That's a pretty low bar, Mr. Walker." "It is," Ethan agreed. "You still cleared it. Half that lobby didn't." Rachel was promoted to assistant branch manager, which surprised nobody who had seen the footage, and then given the job of rolling the new staff training out across the entire eastern region, which surprised her considerably. She tried to say that she had not really done anything, that she had made an offer to dial a phone number and had then been quiet for 8 minutes like everyone else. "You were the only person in that building who said the true thing out loud," Ethan told her. "Twice, while your boss was standing there threatening your job. You want to tell me that's nothing? Tell it to somebody who wasn't there." Then he said the part he had actually driven over to say. "There was a moment where my daughter asked a whole room why nobody would say I hadn't done anything wrong, and nobody answered her. She's going to carry that. But she also watched you step in front of a terminal to stop evidence getting deleted. She's going to carry that too. I would rather she had both than only the first one." The bank voided the original check and issued a replacement, and Ethan split it exactly as he had always intended, down to the dollar. Half into the fund for Grace locked untouched the way it had been planned before any of this. The other half became the seed money for the Walker single-parent scholarship. He made one change to the plan. He insisted that the first round of scholarships be administered out of the Ellsworth branch itself. His lawyers thought it was symbolic and slightly petty. It was neither. Ethan wanted the specific building that had decided he did not belong in it to be the building responsible for handing opportunity to families that looked a great deal like his own, permanently on a calendar every year, whether or not anyone was still filming. 3 months later, he and Grace walked back through those same glass doors. He was driving the same sedan. He was wearing the same jacket. He had thought about replacing both and had decided against it because changing either one would have meant conceding that Diane had been asking a reasonable question. Grace held his hand the way she had that first afternoon, except there was nothing tight in it this time. It was just a kid walking beside her father on an errand. An employee greeted them before they were 4 feet inside and asked what she could help them with, which was a small thing, and which was also the entire point. There was a placard by the entrance now. Customer rights printed in language a person could actually read at the height of somebody standing in line, with a phone number at the bottom for a complaint line that did not route through anybody who worked in that building. Grace read the whole thing. She read slowly, moving her lips a little on the longer words. Then she looked up at her father. "Is this because of us?" "It's because of you, mostly," Ethan said. "You asked the right question." Rachel came over into her new role and said the first wave of training had already run in every branch in the region, and that the early feedback had been better than anyone had projected, mostly from tellers. Mostly variations of the same sentence, "I did not know I was allowed to." Dean was near the door in his uniform. When he saw Ethan, he gave a small nod, and Ethan returned it, and there was nothing tense in it at all. Ethan noticed something else while they waited and did not say anything about it. Not one of the customers who had stood there filming had ever come back to that branch. He understood the arithmetic. Some kinds of silence prefer to relocate rather than be looked at. At the far counter, a young woman was opening a savings account for her son, who looked about 6 and was extremely interested in the pen on its little chain. Nobody asked her where the money came from. Nobody looked at her coat or out the window at whatever she had parked at the curb. A teller walked her through the paperwork and complimented the kid's dinosaur backpack. Grace watched the two of them for a long moment. "Is that why you didn't shut it down?" she asked. "You could have, right? Mr. Whitman said you could have." Ethan took his time with the answer because he wanted her to actually keep it rather than just hear it. "I could have," he said, "and it would have felt good for about a week. Then that woman over there would be opening that account somewhere else, and whoever's behind that counter would still be somebody's Diane, and nothing would have changed except that I'd have gotten even. He nodded toward the placard by the door. Closing a door is easy, Grace. Anybody with enough money can close a door. Making one open for everybody, that's the hard version. That's the one worth doing. Grace nodded slowly the way she did when she was turning something over rather than accepting it, and looked back at the woman at the counter. Before they left, there was one more thing on the schedule. A 17-year-old named Marcus Bell was waiting in the small conference room with his father, a man who worked 2 shifts at a distribution center and had raised the boy alone since he was 4, and who had put on a tie for this. Ethan had asked for a specific arrangement, and the branch had agreed to it. Grace handed Marcus the letter herself. She had brought something with her. She had been carrying it in her coat pocket for 3 months, flattened and folded and refolded until the crease had gone soft, one torn quarter of a $5 million check with part of the word Walker still legible along the edge. She put it on the table next to the letter and slid it toward her father. "You can have it back now," she said. "I don't need it anymore." Ethan looked at that piece of paper for a while. She had been 8 years old in a bank lobby watching a room full of adults decide it was not their problem. And she had picked up the one piece she could reach and held onto it for 3 months. And she was setting it down now in the same building because a boy she had never met was sitting across the table from her, holding an envelope with his name on it. That was the moment the $5 million finally became worth something, and it had almost nothing to do with the number. The 3 of them walked out together into a cold, clear afternoon, Ethan and Grace, and finally 3 months late they went and did the rest of the plan. The bookstore where he let her take 4 books instead of 3, because at that point the negotiation was frankly not competitive. Then dinner at the diner on 5th Street where the waitress brought her extra pickles without being asked. So here's the question worth sitting with. If you had been standing in that lobby with your phone already out, would you have been one of the 11? Or would you have been Rachel because Ethan Walker did not win the afternoon? Gerald Whitman walked through that door and called him sir. That was not a victory. That was a rescue, and it arrived by accident at 2 minutes past 5, and it would not have arrived at all for almost anybody else standing in that line. The victory came later and quietly when a man who had every reason to burn a building down decided instead to rebuild the inside of it so that the next person through those doors would never need a rescue in the first place. Nobody should have to be worth $5 million to be treated like a human being. If this one moved, you subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and tell me in the comments. Have you ever been the person in the room who spoke up or the one who wished they had?